Good morning, Anahi.
Hey Dan, good morning.
What are we chatting about today?
Today we are talking about change. So how is AI changing our daily lives, generational patterns, and then moving to another country?
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, high-tech, long-term, and geographic change. Just a whole bunch of different types. So to start us off here, what do we want to talk about first?
So the big one here is, I guess, AI. In almost all the meetings that I've attended so far, everywhere we go, AI gets brought up at some point. Outside of work, I don't know if you've seen online, but AI is very popular right now for generating babies. What babies would look like in the future. But like in work and specifically right now, like for example, we're using it to do like note taking, still obviously taking into account that it'll come back with some mistakes. It's really good at making you believe that it's always going to be right. But that also comes with like hallucinations and again, making it seem like they're perfect. When it comes to financial planning and using AI, I think me personally, it would be like when your chest hurts or something and you Google it and it comes back with like something scary, like you're gonna die, you have this or you have that.
Like the WebMD thing, everything's cancer.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, I think like financial planning kind of is that way because it's your money. It's something very special to you. It's a big thing in your life. So basically we have to keep up with, we have to stay up to pace with AI. Just wanted to see what do you trust AI with when it comes to that? When it comes to like financial planning?
I don't really trust AI for anything in financial planning. Mm-hmm. And I think I have to draw kind of a clear distinction here in that there's a really, really excellent paper by Dr. Michael Kovakota that was published back in January that essentially highlights that AI is currently, and this could change in the future, but he kind of makes the case that it's going to be a very high hurdle. But AI is not good at prioritizing. It's very good at answering problems in isolation. You know, if you ask AI like 1 + 1, what is that? It's going to be good at that. Mm-hmm. But if you ask AI to prioritize multiple disparate priorities and objectives, it doesn't have judgment. It has probability. Mm-hmm. And so the problem with that is that probability is informed from a set of sort of unknown databases. This is kind of where the black box problem of AI comes in, where hallucinations come from. In that when you use a large language model, you're asking it to use predictive probability-driven analytics to come up with an answer. And so to come back to your question, then, you know, when somebody says, you know, what do you think AI is trustworthy for in financial planning? The mathematical answer is essentially nothing. Because AI is not actually thinking about your problem and answering your problem in light of your priorities and your circumstances and your details and, you know, what matters to you more or less and so on, your history. Mm-hmm. It's just using probability to say, well, it seems like based on, you know, probability, the best answer would be this, followed by this, followed by this. Mm-hmm. And so all that to say, I think where we can have greater reliance on AI is in select, you know, kind of discrete tasks, right? Like asking AI to listen to a recording, transcribe our words, and then analyze its transcription of our words to generate a set of notes and takeaways is a discrete task, because we're not asking it for as much judgment there, so much as, you know, nominal judgment. What word did you say? Mm-hmm. And then based on that transcription, what is a reasonable summary of what was said? That's where I think AI is really strong right now. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to this question of where does it fit in financial planning, it's going to have a bigger and bigger role in technology going forward. But until they can start to really chip away at the hallucination problem, it's going to kind of hit a ceiling, I think.
Mm-hmm. When I was preparing for this, I found that around 70% of financial advisors are already experiencing with AI. We're part of them. But more than 80% of investors still say that they would want some type of human advisor working in the process. So I think, for example, like me, I'd be scared to invest like $1,000 in the stock market if I didn't know what to do. And if I just search it up with ChatGPT or ask ChatGPT or ask some sort of like AI and it comes with the answer of what it should be, it doesn't take into account that I'm scared to do it. I don't think it. This is where like the emotional aspect of it would come in, where AI doesn't care how you feel. AI will just give you the right answer in like how it was programmed in their system. So I think it's just a lot of emotional things, aspects that AI wouldn't be able to recognize that like a actual human would be able to recognize.
Well, I think it's an important call out, but I'll even raise a challenge somebody made recently. I think it was Dan Hyatt out of the UK who just wrote kind of this article about like a lot of financial advisors are burying their heads around the risks AI pose to their field. And one of the things he called out as a common defense that we financial planners would give right now is, well, I'm a person and my clients are people and they want to talk to people and it's an emotional business. And, he kind of points out, like, yeah, sure it is, but plenty of people have said that about a lot of things, right? Nobody will want to drive a car themselves. They're going to want to, somebody to drive for them. Nobody's going to want to push the buttons on the elevator themselves. It's too scary. They're going to want an elevator operator. I think that's a little bit flippant on his part, but I understand the point he was trying to make, which is just because people like working with people doesn't mean that AI can't get good enough that people get comfortable enough to just go ahead and use it to try to solve their financial problems. I think the challenge that exists here is the same challenge that a lot of sort of professional services have, which is there's an overconfidence in checklists, which is to say, let's use personal trainers, right? Everybody listening to this, everybody knows that to be, generally speaking, in good health and in good shape, you should eat less, eat better, exercise more. Right? Like that. Yep. And you can chop that up in 1,000 different ways to say, like, you should do 30 minutes of cardio and, 20 minutes of high intensity lifting. And you should, be doing physical activity at least an hour a day, at least 5 days a week. And your caloric intake should be no more than 2,000 calories. And it should be mostly, lean proteins and lots of vegetables. So all this stuff. Yeah. This is so well known, right? Like nobody on earth doesn't know this in a general sense. And there's a million books about it, and there's a million podcasts about it, and there's a million YouTube channels about it, and there's a million apps. Like, there's so much information about this. And yet, right? And yet, people don't eat well. And yet, people don't exercise as much as they should. And yet, people who are overweight, right, myself included, know that we should do better, right? And we have all the tools we could possibly need to accomplish a better quality of life. And yet, we don't do it. So I think it's interesting because the argument here goes that technology can disintermediate human connection. And it is, to a certain extent, right? You hear about people who are like dating their ChatGPT account, which is, I'm going to be completely honest, fucking crazy. Weird. Yes. Like, these people need psychological help, not AI. But barring what good that is doing in their lives, right, there's still a need for human connection in a lot of ways. And there's also just the confidence factor. It's one thing to say, I'm willing to trust a checklist or a blog I read online or a video I watched on YouTube with trading out my alternator in my car. And if I get stuck along the way, I guess I can always just take it to mechanic. But there's certain decisions that are that are exclusive in purpose. If you put all your money in an investment, it has to go well. And if it doesn't go well, there is no, it didn't go well, I guess I'll just figure it out afterwards thing. It's your life savings. It could be the case that you lose it all, right? That you lose years or decades that you cannot replace. So I put all this caution around to say, I think financial planning is a tool, or is a process well aided by AI tools, and will only get better aided by AI tools. But all that to say, I do not subscribe to the belief that somehow, in the same way people talked about robo-advisors a decade ago, in the same way people talked about the internet 20, 30 years ago, in the same way people talked about typewriters, in the same way that people talked about cars, like there's always this element of new technology is going to just destroy everything. And I think that is a tale as old as time.
So what do you think, when do you think is okay for somebody who doesn't have like a financial advisor to trust AI?
I think it really depends on how much you can survive it being wrong.
Oh,
right.
Okay.
And I apply this to more than just AI and even more than financial advice, like legal advice, medical advice, etc. Right. It's the that classic example somebody gave a little while ago, where it was can I eat hemlock? And if you prompt that question into a certain AI well enough, it'll say sure you can. And if you eat hemlock, you will die. right?
Yeah.
And so there's an element here of like, okay, if you can't survive the consequences of it being wrong, it's not a question you should be asking. You can use it to help develop your understanding. I think it's a great educational tool in a lot of ways. It can help sort of give you prompts to better research and learn about and ask questions about. But if it's your life savings, if it's the welfare of your family, right, if it's going to be the thing that makes or breaks your career, if you can't survive it being wrong, don't do it. Right? Again, it doesn't mean you can't ask the question or use it as a foundation, but it's the same thing as insurance. I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. And the same thing here with AI. I'm happy to have AI as a tool for all sorts of applications, but I would never rely on it for a life-changing decision.
That being said, AI is pretty cool. I think it's pretty fascinating. I mean, somebody who studied this for a while, I think AI is fascinating, but I don't like you said, it's not at the level where you can put your 100% trust on. Like last week we talked about the e-money updates that are happening, how it'll be able to give us assumptions, and at some point it'll be able to read documents. But I think the assumptions part is pretty cool because it'll be able to point out things that maybe we could have just passed through, something that we couldn't have, that we wouldn't have thought about. And that's what it's taught to do. It's taught to bring up the things that we as humans sometimes forget to do, or that's what it's trained for. So I guess what I'm trying to get to is how do you see AI helping your business grow in the long run?
Well, I think you actually just touched on an area in e-money as a good specific example where I actually think it will be helpful. Interestingly enough, though, what you actually just described, this whole thing about it coming up with recommendations, is not actually going to be AI driven. It's actually a very advanced rule set that they're building. I'm sure they'll come out with an AI version at some point in the future, but what they're coming up with here in the near future is not actually AI based, which surprised me. I thought they would jump to AI, but instead they've done sort of this internal study of the hundreds of thousands of financial plans that have been pushed through their system to find sort of best practice recommendations and to automate some rule sets around if-then conditions for recommendations. But to come back to your question, I think what you described is actually idea generation, which has been a thing that AI has been good at sort of since day one, 2-3 years ago when ChatGPT was released. One of the first uses people started using it for was, hey, I need 10 ideas for a blog. Hey, I need an idea for social media posts and content. And AI can just vomit ideas at you rapid fire, right? Give me 1,000 suggestions for podcast names, and it'll just crank it. They will not all be good, right? But it can really grind out a ton of stuff. And so in that context, I think even financial planning, that's an area where it'll be helpful, right? Hey, give me 30, now that we've put in the financial planning data, give me 30 ideas here about, things that we may not have already included in our financial plan model. And it might come out and be like, based on this and this and this and this, maybe there is a benefit to modeling and showing this, but we'll still need human judgment to understand whether that's actually relevant, useful, or accurate in this client situation. I think some of the more common ones we're starting to see is document reading. Historically speaking, for the last decade or so, OCR, optical character recognition, has been a thing that exists where essentially, for anybody who doesn't know what that means, you have a PDF document and computers can read certain types of PDF documents and pull important data out of it. Classic example in our field would be tax documents. For the last 5 or 6 years now, we've had tools that are really good at scraping data out of tax forms because tax forms are uniform documents where certain fields always have a certain meaning. And so if you pull a number out and you set up rules around how those numbers are supposed to compare, you can identify errors in tax returns, you can identify missed tax credits or opportunities for deductions. There's a lot of cool things like that already exist. I think AI will get better and better at reading less uniform documentation, right? Somebody has a will. Wills have a certain vibe to them, a certain structure to them, but if there was just a will template that everybody was supposed to use, that already would have been disintermediated. So I think there's certain things like that will become more and more popular as time goes on.
And I'm excited to see that. I think it's pretty cool. I think we've touched on this before, where it'll take over some of the administrative work that somebody would be doing, and you could be using that time to talk to clients while you're taking your time to going through the long documents that sometimes don't even seem like it's English. So I think that'll be very helpful. I guess moving on to our next topic about change, scary change. I wanted to touch on like generational wealth. It starts somewhere. It starts at a certain generation. It grows over time. It shrinks over time. There are obviously patterns that occur. Again, like when I was preparing for this, I saw a Williams Group study. I don't know if you've heard about it. I think we talked about this before, but their 70% of the family's wealth runs out in the second generation, and then 90% by the third generation. I thought this was very interesting. I think older generations tend to focus more on stability since they already went through all that change. But younger generations are having to keep moving forward with all the changes. What patterns do you see with like repeating across families when it comes to like savings and responsibility throughout time?
So I think there's sort of a that which is old is new pattern to this, which is you talked about older generations favoring stability, but that's not a trait of, let's say, traditionalists or boomers specifically. Mm-hmm. That's a cycle that occurs, right? When you are young, everything is new, you have opportunities, life is sort of a blank page. As you get further along in life, financial systems, tax systems, certain assumptions become more important because you've lived your life to a certain point based on those prior assumptions. Take something like generation 1, generation 2, generation 3 cycles. We can maybe use, let's say, a wealthy, affluent family as one example, and we can use maybe an immigrant family as another example. There's that Williams study you brought up, which is essentially that, the first generation builds the wealth, right? They're successful entrepreneurs, professionals, they invent something, they're music artists, whatever it is. They do something that makes their family well off. You then often see that the second generation, instead of doing the exact same thing that the parents did, often is directed into professional endeavors, right? So you see a lot of doctors, lawyers, etc., as the children of wealthy people who may not have made their money being doctors or lawyers, right? But instead being entrepreneurs. And the idea here is, hey, I had to work really, really hard to build my widget factory, whatever it is that we did, and I want my kids to have a good life, and I see how well the lawyers and the doctors that I've known in my life have done, so I'm going to use my affluence to build opportunity for them to go through these professional paths with greater security. And then by the time that second generation has their kids, they are, maybe felt a little constrained. Mom or dad really made me, go to law school, really made me go to medical school. And like, I've had a good life and I've had a lot of success from it, but I really wish I'd had more choices, more freedom. So the third generation is going to be enabled to sort of do whatever you want. We've got the money, be artists, be poets, live your life, do whatever it is. And so you see this, accumulation of wealth, this preservation of wealth, and then this sort of disregard for how the wealth was made that occurs. And this is not universal, but this is sort of the trend that you bring up where, 70% of families, affluence is sort of lost by the next generation, 90% by the generation following. So that's sort of the pattern that we see on that side. If we go to the immigrant side, we can sometimes see a similar story, but a very different story, right? Mom and dad, or mom or dad or somebody, whatever it is, moved to this country to find opportunity. And they could have come from the UK or France and maybe had a more Western affluent background, but a lot of people come from Central America, South America, Asia, and within Africa, and within that, the United States is the golden ticket. If we move here, if we can live here, if we can build a life here, this is going to be how our family for generations thrives and prospers. The second generation then often shoulders a different burden, right? In the wealthy example, it was, we're pushed into these high touch obligations and so on for safety and security. For the second generation in immigrant families, often they become the source of affluence for the prior generation. So it's not wealth trickling down from on high. Instead, it's subsidization. It is, okay, I worked really hard, right? I came here from Colombia, Mexico, Argentina, wherever it was. And I worked, back-breaking hours, 60 hours a week in construction my whole life. And you did that to provide for my family, to give my kids an opportunity to really live the American dream. But we have family still back in the home country. I am still working this construction job, et cetera. And so when my sons or daughters become lawyers, become entrepreneurs, become doctors, Now we look at them and say, we did this for you so you could be successful, and now it's your turn to support the family. And that, instead of kind of going from generation 1 to generation 2, flows both directions, because now generation 2 is being asked to help support generation 1, right? Pay it back, what you owe us, quote unquote, and also being asked to build their own lives. And so often, generation by generation, there can be this sort of protraction where the Gen 2 effect really extends into Gen 3 and Gen 4 before there's been enough generational turnover, financial turnover, etc., that it really takes maybe into Gen 4, 5, 6 before the family sort of has a blank slate from that generational trauma caused by all the work and effort and struggle that occurred in the first generation.
And then start from there. Yeah, I think it's very interesting to see like both like the families that you mentioned, and seeing like the changes that would happen throughout generation through generation. It's, I don't know, I feel like, for example, for like the second family that you mentioned, not even just like that type of family, but like a family who wasn't, or like parents who weren't able to, for whatever reason it could have been, they were able to save for their retirement. I think a lot of these times the children end up having to take care of that retirement, taking that weight onto their shoulders. How do you think responsibility and shows up? How do you think responsibility and guilt shows up differently with these kids who are having to take this on later on in the future?
I think there's an interesting historical precedent for this, which is the number of children families used to have 100, 150 years ago. So go back to the 1800s, and it was very common for families to essentially have as many children as humanly possible. This is where you get like the family photos from early photography, where it's like mom, dad, and like 17 children. And part of that is just birth control and contraceptives and things that didn't exist at that time. But that was actually an economic choice, because you're like, well, most people back in the day were poor, so wouldn't having more children make that worse? Yes and no, right? It turns out certain things were easy, right? Food was easy in a relative sense, but more importantly, having multiple children, keeping in mind mortality rates were higher back then and so on, was a big deal, because the more children you had, the higher the probability, just by the law of large numbers, that somebody was going to be a success, right? That somebody was going to make a name for themselves and do something, and so on. And so part of that then gets into like inheritance, right? It was very common for just sort of the first son to inherit everything. Yeah. And if you were kid number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you're on your own. You've got to make something of yourself. But again, mortality rates being what they were, kid 2, kid 6, kid 9 might die of malaria or polio or, measles or something like that, well before they ever got anywhere. So again, it was sort of a risk management decision. Today, we see much lower birth rates in first world countries like the United States. We still see high birth rates in places like Africa, Central America, South America, parts of Asia, not all of it, but in certain areas. And it's still a very similar type of thinking, where we again, may not have good access to contraception, but also, again, more children means more opportunity. So in that context, when we come to the first world context, where parents might only have 1 or 2 children, but still be faced with a very similar economic struggle like you described, right? Where, the parents were not able to save for retirement, et cetera. There's a real values conversation that has to be had here. And so the answer is not going to just be, well, here's what you do in that situation. It's going to be a question of, has there always been an understanding that the sacrifice of Gen 1 was being made for the benefit of Gen 2, and Gen 2 owes it to their parents? And in turn, is Gen 2 willing to accept that responsibility? Because that's sort of the tough decision here. There is no legal requirement that you support your parents past a certain point. Doesn't mean you might not think it's the right thing to do, that it's ethical, it's moral, it's a responsibility that's been impressed upon you. But there is nothing that stops any Gen 2 child from just saying, sorry, mom and dad, thank you for giving me birth, raising me, feeding me, clothing me, but I am not going to sacrifice my great life for you. And I'm not making a moral distinction here and saying that's the right or the wrong thing to do. I'm saying that that's a choice that the second generation has. In certain communities, for example, in African-American communities, there's a phenomenon that's called the black tax. And a really good example of this is that you see in professional athletes, right? For example, a large disproportionate amount of professional football players are African-American. There's a whole separate conversation about genetics and culture and background and all that, but it's very common for professional athletes to retire broke. not because they overspent or overindulged on themselves,
Mm-hmm.
right? Some do, but not all. But often because when you're the first success in a family that's come up from poverty, you often then turn into the bank for the family, right? Well, Joey over here is making $2 million a year, so he can help pay off that mortgage. He can help pay for his cousin's medical bills. He can send money back to the home country, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. So that is the phenomenon that we have to be cognizant of, that in a deep and specific way, the first success in a family often is asked to become the provider for the family. Mm-hmm. And that's not a fair burden, right? And that may not be a burden that persists generation over generation. But to be the first success in your family is to have a choice put before you.
Mm-hmm. This also comes with making mistakes along the way for the younger generations, where they don't know what they're doing and they hear stories from other people or get advice from just anybody because they think that any advice is good advice. So I think this is where a lot of mistakes happen. For example, like getting scammed or like getting cold called for something and you're like, oh, sounds amazing. Well, this isn't like a scam, but for example, you're being told you're wanting to buy a house and somebody tells you, don't give a down payment, don't give a zero down payment, but in your eyes, again, it's your little light bulb is gonna turn on. It's amazing. Why wouldn't I do it? It's I'll be saving that extra amount and I could use that for a mortgage. But these are just things that aren't learned over time because it's obviously the people who are starting. But yeah, I think this is it's interesting to see patterns from generation to generation to generation, and then how long it takes for a generation to normalize that transferring over wealth over time, if that makes sense.
Well, and you brought up making mistakes along the way, scams and whatnot, but there's an interesting thing here, which is there's just the immediate harm, mm-hmm. right? Let's use you as an example. Let's say you and Anahi met a friend, and the friend was telling you about this great investment. You and some other investors gonna buy an apartment complex, mm-hmm. And you all put your money together. It's a real investment. It's not even a scam. Mm-hmm. But let's say it goes south. Right, mm-hmm. Somebody slips, trips, or falls at the apartment complex due to poor maintenance, and they sue the complex. And by the end of it, 4 or 5 years down the road, you get nothing back from this investment. Mm-hmm. You don't just lose a little bit, zero. You put in $5,000, you have nothing to show for it. Mm-hmm. You are going to have a biological, psychological bias against that type of investment in the future. Mm-hmm. Right, you are going to tell your partner, your spouse, your future children, whoever it is. Oh gosh, never invest in apartment complexes or real estate, right? I did that once, I lost all my money. Mm-hmm. And some people will take you seriously and some won't take you seriously. But of the people who take you seriously, your kids might hear real estate is a bad investment, never invest in real estate. Yeah. That may not have been the actual message you're trying to tell them. You're just trying to tell them, well, one time I invested in real estate, it went poorly. Mm-hmm. But now what they've heard is mom invested in real estate and that is a bad idea. Don't ever do that. Mm-hmm. So maybe I'm never going to buy a house. Maybe I'm never going to buy a great real estate investment or whatever it is. We see the same thing in the stock holding puzzle, right? A lot of people lost money in the .com bubble. A lot of people lost money in 2008. And so they've told their children, told their family members, told their friends in their community, don't invest in the stock market. The stock market's too risky. Mm-hmm. But again, by all available evidence and data, of which there's an enormous volume, the stock market writ large is one of the best wealth building tools out there, bar none. So, the trick here is there's the immediate harm that can occur when something bad happens financially, and there can be generational harm that occurs when somebody's bad experience turns into generational wealth destructive behaviors.
As being an advisor for 10 plus years now, do you see a lot of younger generations asking for financial advice, or do you think this has to do with the fact of them being scared to ask for help, or them being scared of not knowing what to do with what's next?
I think there's a barbell here. I think there's a large population that's not, mm-hmm. right? And there's a whole variety that are not asking for it, not getting involved in it, not learning about it. Mm-hmm. There is, I'm going to call it, and sorry for anybody who feels this is a little flippant, but I think there's sort of an affluent white kid prep school population mm-hmm. out there where you'll hear stories, and the trick is I'm hearing these stories from like the parents, right, or the affluent people, colleagues that I have in my personal community, my professional community, who are like, oh, my kids went to a sleepover, and we had some friends over, and they were all talking about like the stocks they're trading on their Robinhood account. Like, wow, the young kids are already getting into investing, and it's like, yeah, but these are the kids or the families from a top 5%, income affluence neighborhood. This is the subjects of like, the families from Mad Men or Your Friends and Neighbors or something who belong to country clubs. This is not a widespread phenomenon, but I do think younger generations are gaining exposure to investing earlier and younger. I think the trick is we're seeing that in tandem with also exposure to gambling, sports betting, DraftKings types of stuff. We're seeing it now in like Polymarket, where people are betting on the weather, people are betting on elections, whether we're going to invade Iran or not. So there's a whole bunch of stuff where there's a lot of people becoming more and more exposed to it. The problem then is that there's two populations there. There's populations who are getting lucky in that environment, who are maybe not seeking more financial information because like, oh, I keep making money doing this. We saw this with crypto 10, 15 years ago. And then there's people who are losing money, who are then either trying to inform themselves and educate themselves, or they're getting burned and they're not going back to it. And they're going to avoid financial activities like saving and investing in the same sense that they maybe should be because they lost some money on Robinhood when they were in college. So there's a bit of a barbell. Some people are getting involved. Some people are not getting involved. Of those who are getting involved, I think there's enthusiasm. Yeah. That's great. I don't know that we're seeing the responsible curiosity that should follow that.
I think with a lot of younger generations, they are just trying to make it. They're trying to, like you said, like be the person that is going to transfer the wealth over time, and help the people who helped you. So I think for like younger generations, it's like a thing trying to figure out like what's gonna make me money. And so like right now, like you said, crypto is famously for making money, but then it's also like the worst way to lose your money as well. So I think there's obviously a connection there where younger generations are just trying to make it. They're trying to be the bank of the family, quote unquote, I guess. But yeah, I think that's very interesting.
Well, and you say crypto is famously for making money, but there's a key difference between speculation and investing. Speculation is I'm going to buy something because everybody's buying it, and if everybody keeps buying it, I'm going to make money, right? And you see this in commodities. You've seen this with gold. If you go back in history, you saw this with tulip bulbs, right? Tulip bulbs were valuable so long as everybody thought they were valuable, and the second everybody stopped thinking they were valuable, they went to zero. Cryptocurrency, and there's like big mainstay names like Ethereum and Solana and Bitcoin, but then there's an entire genre of what are colloquially called shit coins, right? Where it's just people like coming up with Dan's hair coin, like just wild dumb things, and the amount of grifting and scamming that occurs there is incredible. I mean, there's like if you measure in dollars, right, it's a multi-billion-dollar scam industry. So on one hand, do people make a lot of money there? Yes, but also unlike the stock market, right, where it's like if I buy Apple, I think Apple's going to be around. It could lose a lot of value. Its stock price could fall to the floor, but there's an enormous company here with facilities, with equipment, with intellectual property, technology, all this stuff. Even if Apple's stock goes down, I don't see Apple just disappearing overnight, right? It could go out of business. It could go bankrupt one day, but that's going to be a slow decline over time. Whereas, any type of cryptocurrency or speculative asset can go to zero overnight because suddenly the faith in the market pops, and the enthusiasm goes away, and now everybody just wants to get out of it. So that's something where we have to be mindful about the type of risk people are taking. Right, it's sort of the old coin flipping phenomenon. Right, if you get 10,000 people to flip coins, heads. After 10 flips, some people have gotten heads every single time. That doesn't mean they were right. Just means that by the law of large numbers, some people do end up lucky.
It's just something people learn over time. And I think financial advising is something that should be more talked about. I feel like it's not talked about enough in a lot of communities. It's something that people see as it's just for the wealthy, and it's not going to help people who are just starting generate that wealth over time. So I just think it's very interesting that it's not that talked about. Like a lot of communities don't know about this, and I think if it was, it would make a lot of change to a lot of up and coming generations.
Certainly.
So lastly, the last change, which I think is the fun one, I always thought about moving to another country, starting somewhere fresh, just somewhere where I don't know anybody, somewhere where I can create a life of my own, having just like a fun time, the dream, I guess. How realistic do you think this is?
I think it depends on where and for how long,
Mm-hmm.
and is it a permanent change or not? Like a lot of countries have sort of these like what I'll call them extended tourism visas.
Mm-hmm.
I'll use New Zealand as an example. Like you can live in New Zealand for up to 2 years and not be trying to become a citizen or a permanent resident.
Mm-hmm.
But every country sort of has a finite tolerance for that, where they're like, okay, you can be here for a while, and like that's great. But if you're going to live here for a long time, you got to be on a path to permanent residency or citizenship of some sort, because long term, what's in the interest of any country is increasing its population of educated, affluent people who can contribute to its economy and its society and so on. And if you're just sort of like popping in for a while, there might be some benefit to that, but it's hard for that to be like a long-term case. So it really depends on that. We have a lot of clients who want to spend, 3-6 months overseas when they retire, or take really protracted, month to month stays in a bunch of places. I think it's very different to say, I'm going to move to the UK indefinitely, or I'm going to move to, Mexico indefinitely, or something like that.
When it comes to like clients like that, is it worth it for them? Do they have the time that they expected, or?
I've never had a client come back and be like, oh, that was terrible, I would never do that again. I think what a lot of them do, and it depends, because certain parts of the world are more expensive than the United States and certain parts are cheaper. I think the ones who go to cheaper places, like a popular thing is, spending several months in like Costa Rica. Costa Rica is way cheaper than the United States. So a lot of people like enjoy that. But there's a lot of things that we have in terms of daily quality of life that are absent or harder to get. So for example, if you go to Central America, if you have money, it's not that hard to walk into a medical clinic and get medical services. But at the same time, depending on where you are, you're in a capital city or a rural area or something like that, it's like, oh, I need a specialist for something. There just may not be a specialist for something. So there's little quality of life things that can vary. Another example, if you go to countries with, single payer, socialized, nationalized medicine, you might be able to get every service you want, but it might be a difference where you can get it essentially for free 6 months down the road, or you can pay a lot of money out of pocket to get it privately offered somewhere. So there's little nuances like that where I don't think most people have regret about living overseas, but I'm always careful about sort of the honeymoon effect, right? Every time you move somewhere, every time something new happens, there's sort of this shiny new novelty experience. But the longer you live somewhere, the more reality is going to set in. It's why when clients tell us, even if they want to move to a different state, we're like, hey, why don't you go rent a place there for like 2 months and just stick your toe in? And then the trick is, don't fill your 2 months up with like fun touristy stuff. Just hang out. Just be there. Because that's sort of the trick with vacations, right? We go to a foreign country and we have a great time because we're doing all the fun tourist stuff. But it's different to live there. So that's sort of the general advice there, is you want to plan well ahead, and you want to sort of dabble in it before you pick up your whole life.
Really, that's it's like the vacation thing. Even when you're like somewhere for 2 weeks, after the first week you're bored. So it's like you're excited to travel somewhere new, start somewhere new, spend time somewhere new, somewhere you haven't been. But I think it's smart, like how you said, even like in another state, here in the U.S., just renting somewhere, testing out the waters. I think that's really smart. I think with a lot of the remote jobs that there is in the market now, a lot of people would see it more of an option, being able to do that now that they're like fully online. How do you see this like going over time with?
I think it depends on how plug and playable your skill set is. I think certain jobs, certain occupations lend themselves to that. So I'll say like really skilled, high level software developers. I think they have an easier time with remote work. I think they have an easier time sort of jumping into and out of the job market because they have this kind of rarefied, special, powerful skill set. I think other jobs are harder to do with that. And in particular, it depends on where you are in your career and your kind of intended progression. Like if somebody says, I want to one day be Jamie Dimon, I want to be the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, you are never going to get that job working remotely. Like you might be able to take certain steps of your career, work it around here, but there's going to come a point at which if you really want to climb that corporate ladder, you're going to have FaceTime. You're going to have to be in person. So I don't want to get too far from your subject being more focused on like living overseas, traveling, that sort of thing. But there are real drawbacks to being sight unseen or for your relationship to your job being just your name in emails and your name in like chat boxes or occasionally your face is like in a Zoom window compared to being there and getting FaceTime. And I'm sure somebody listening can be like, okay, Boomer Dan, like, you know, you got to be around the water cooler and network to get ahead. But like, people don't build strong relationships or as strong of relationships with the characters of somebody's name in a chat screen. Yeah. You build better relationships face to face in company with each other. So that's just something where, you know, you can definitely do it in certain occupations and fields. And I think it's easier to do now than it's ever been, but you have to want certain things for your life for that to be a good idea. And if you want different things, it may not be the right fit.
I guess in hindsight, like what, when it comes to like preparing for it, what advice would you give beforehand?
Are we talking about a permanent relocation or just like I want to be remote for a while?
Maybe like 6 months.
I mean, first and foremost, you need to know whether your job or your work works with that. Yeah. You know, depending on your occupation, it may not matter where you are. And if you've got enough seniority, tenure, et cetera, and you say like, hey, like, you know, I want to be somewhere else for a while. That's okay. I think of my colleague, Megan Lertz, Dr. Megan Lertz, who, you know, her spouse is a military spouse. And so I think she, like in the time I've known her, she's lived in Spain, I think the UK, Missouri. She's lived in California. Like she's constantly moving, but she's an academic and a researcher and a speaker. Okay. And so it's very easy for her to pick up and move because her job is not so closely tied to a specific place. And so it's something where I think it depends on the you know, ease of which you can do your job remotely, right? Like if you work in a metal factory, can't do that remotely, right? You know, but if you're a lawyer, if you're an accountant, if you're a software developer, and you've got an amenable employer, I think there's a possibility where you can get away with it. I think the other thing you have to prepare for, and this is going to be the part where some people are going to kind of like wink and smile a little bit, or you know, sort of be a little bit uncomfortable. A lot of people think they work really well remotely, and they don't. They don't have discipline. And the challenge of working remotely is you need to still act like you have a job, not like you have this sort of part-time flingy thing where if you're like, well, just like I'll sign on and I'll do my work between trips. I'll do it, you know, when we have some downtime, whatever. But it's like, look, just because you moved to Costa Rica for 6 months doesn't mean that your employer and your work aren't going to require you to really commit some blocks of time to get the work done. And this, frankly, this even applies for people who work from home sometimes. Some people work from home and they're like, well, if something pops up, I'll do it. But otherwise, I'm going to like watch TV. And see what I can get away with. So just being mindful that if you are not a very disciplined, structured person, remote work may be harder for you. So that's the first thing. If you don't have that skill set, build that skill set. The other thing is understand what protracts this and what shortens this, right? You might have a very romantic idea of what it's going to be like to work overseas or to live overseas or to relocate for a while, but understand if your work or your time away actually are working well together. I think there's some people who move overseas and they have a hard time unplugging from work. And then it's like, well, what was the point of this? And conversely, some people, again, kind of have a discipline challenge. And the other option here is maybe you're not going to work. Maybe you're going to take a sabbatical. In that case, it's just about financial runway. Have we built up the sufficient savings to make this period of our life work well? And then have we realistically researched how easy it's going to be for us to get back into the workforce when that time comes?
Well, we are hiring. In light of that, what are some things you take into consideration when interviewing international students? Do you consider international students?
We do, but here's the thing that I'm immediately cautious for, particularly those who are looking for like an H-1B visa, H-B-1 visa, whatever you say it. We pay enough to be eligible for one lottery ticket in the H-1B visa system, and you can get up to 4 tickets in your job. And I'm cognizant that we are probably not a great place for somebody who really is pinning their hopes on getting a job in the United States and living in the United States permanently. It's not to say we wouldn't hire somebody in that case, but it's like, look, you get 1 ticket. And if you're not in grad school continuing your education at the same time, then you only ever get that 1 ticket if you come work here. And so, hey, if you want to pin your hopes on it, cool. I'm okay with that. I'm here to support you. I think there's been some incredibly talented people who come in from overseas. But, if you took that investment banking job where you're making 140 out of school automatically, you are going to get more shots at being able to stay long term. And so that's just the thing where it's like, look, I'm not going to turn somebody down because they're international, but I want to be very clear and realistic about, hey, this is not the best possible opportunity for that and your long term ability to stay in the States.
Oh, makes sense. Well, that was my spiel on change.
Fair enough. Or your prompting of me to spiel.
Yes, prompting to you spiel.
Fair. Well, then, what have you learned this week that you think you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, so one of our previous meetings, I think last week or a couple weeks before, I heard the term jumbo loans, and initially I was like, nah, it's not that. Wait, because you hear terms where it's like serious terms, like serious financial terms, and you hear jumbo loans, and I was like...
Jumbo doesn't sound like a real term, right? It feels a little, like, made up.
Yes, I wrote that down in my notes, and I was like, are jumbo loans real? So I went in and searched it up, and so it is loans, and it's basically what the name states. From what I gathered, it's a loan for higher priced properties. So it's a type of loan that is used when a mortgage is higher than the conforming loan limit set by the Federal Housing Finance Agency. I searched up the Boulder County one, and currently it's at $839,750. So while this is a huge number, and it means having less flexibility for the buyer, it also allows people to purchase homes or properties while preserving some of that liquidity instead of tying all of their assets to one thing.
Yeah, I'll correct one thing in there. It's not about the value of the home you're buying. It's about the amount of the loan you're taking out. And those are not uncorrelated, right? If I want to buy a $2 million house versus $1 million house, unless I've got the $1 million in cash of difference, I'm going to end up taking out a bigger loan. But that is one of the things to kind of keep in mind here. The big part that you also mentioned is the non-conforming. Right? When we say non-conforming, what we mean, is as you described, right? It's above that FHFA limit, and that's sort of set at a county level or a municipality level. But in that context, what's important to keep in mind is that when it's non-conforming, that means it's going to be harder to package up as part of a mortgage-backed security, which is where we get into like the 2008 crisis, where we had a lot of bad loans being packaged together, and that was a problem. But in that context, then what that also translates to is higher interest rates, because the loan is going to be harder for the lender to sell at some point as part of a securities kind of product. And so you end up paying more because you borrowed more. And in total fairness, right, you're borrowing more money, the risk is greater to the lender. So there's also that. But that's a big driver where if you can avoid taking out a jumbo loan, you're going to end up with better interest rates, and you're going to have an easier time in underwriting. But that sometimes you just need to borrow enough to buy that special property, and you're going to end up with a jumbo loan.
See, it's serious stuff. That's why I didn't think jumbo loan was a real term. So guess it is.
There's a bunch of weird financial terms out there, and jumbo loan is just one of them.
Yep.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.